New analysis from the Congressional Budget Office estimates Republicans' so-called Big Beautiful Bill would increase the debt by about $3.4 trillion over the next decade. The new dynamic scoring data is another blow to President Trump's signature legislation, which passed the House last month, but is now facing scrutiny and significant revisions in the Senate. As it stands, the House Republican bill would extend and expand Trump's expiring tax cuts from 2017 and would pay for some of those expensive parts with deep cuts to federal anti-poverty programs like Medicaid and food stamps. The fresh data factors in the effect of both higher GDP growth and higher interest rates and exceeds the previous estimate of $2.4 trillion. So if your concerns about the debt weren't enough already, there's this. Republican lawmakers have set a deadline of July 4th to send the bill to President Trump's desk, but are likely to push that amid disagreements among senators about the impact of the debt and deficit. Joining us now, congressional reporter for Semafor, Eleanor Mueller. Eleanor, the Senate is unveiling the key components of their legislative changes to this bill. What's troubling to senators about that? What are we hearing from House members who were already concerned about the debt but tried to get over it because of the political currents here? What are you making of the changes from the Senate side?
Yeah, so there's two changes that Senate Republicans themselves have raised concerns about. You know, one is this more aggressive changes to Medicaid. We've seen moderates like Senator Hawley raise concerns over that. You know, of particular concern is the fact that they're actually lowering the tax on healthcare providers that helps pay for Medicare. That was kind of a red line for some of those folks. Susan Collins, who's the chair of the Appropriations Committee, has said that she's worried about that too. There's also this question of how long to take to phase out the Biden-era clean energy tax credits. And that's something that, you know, Senator Tillis told me yesterday he's still looking to get more time so that businesses can have as much flexibility in ramping down their plans. And so those are both issues where I think the conference itself, even in the Senate, is raising concerns and trying to make some tweaks. Yeah. As far as the House goes, the main change that I think is problematic for them is this idea of this cap on the state and local tax deduction. You know, the House passed a bill that would quadruple it to $40,000. It was a big win for blue state Republicans like Mike Lawler. And, you know, the Senate proposed in its text out this week to bring that all the way back down to its current level. And that provoked a lot of upset among those same moderates who they're going to need to get this thing done in the House.
Yeah, I think there's some really fascinating dynamics here. For example, the fact that we are calling Senator Josh Hawley a moderate in this way. I mean, it's fascinating. And what does it tell you about this bill and the fact that some of the people who are usually the most aligned with MAGA are actually concerned about it?
Yeah, we've seen some very fascinating alliances coming out of this. And I think Hawley, it's one great example. Again, Susan Collins, another great example. You know, these people who are typically pretty staunch conservatives in some ways and on this are saying, you know, I think you've taken it too far and I need to pump the brakes. We're seeing a lot of the same conversations on the rescissions package that Trump sent to the Hill that the House just passed. Susan Collins has said, you know, some of those cuts to foreign aid, they go too far for me, and I'm going to have to make some changes before we move this through the Senate.
Yeah, I do think we're seeing some pretty interesting dynamics here around what it means to be MAGA. I think we're also seeing that when it comes to this potential for the U.S. to become directly involved in the Israel-Iran conflict. I was struck yesterday by the Vice President, J.D. Vance, going up to Capitol Hill. It seemed like, if I was reading between the lines on what he was saying, that he was trying to lay the groundwork, at least for an argument in favor of Trump if he were to decide to do direct strikes or more directly implicate and involve the United States in this. I mean, talk about what he said, why he was up there, what you saw in that.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's interesting and notable, first of all, that he came at kind of short notice. You know, normally we have a little more advanced warning if the vice president's going to go to the Hill, and it was kind of the day of that the White House was like, hey, Vance is going to be at your weekly lunch with Senate Republicans. He talked about reconciliation super, super briefly. I think it was just enough to say, you know, as long as you do this by August, we'll be fine.
Right.
But most of it, he did spend talking about Iran. And it's the same message that we've seen, honestly, on almost every single policy issue in this administration. You know, give the president as much flexibility and as much really unconditional support to do whatever he wants to do, regardless of how you might personally feel about it. And we'll see where we end up from there, which is, a new tone for Congress generally on foreign policy.
A new tone. And then also, we were talking about this with Jake Traylor from Politico yesterday, the idea that when it comes to an interventionist foreign policy, it is a rift in MAGA world, because even there are clips circulating online of an early view of an interview that Tucker Carlson did with Senator Ted Cruz, where they are sparring over whether or not to get involved in Iran.
Donald Trump's big bill is bigly unpopular. Today, new polling from the Washington Post and Ipsos shows that Americans oppose the plan 2-1. It turns out cutting taxes for the very wealthy and for big corporations while cutting health care for everyone else is not very popular. And if you were hoping the Senate would moderate the worst impulses of the House Republican caucus, I got some bad news. As it turns out, the Senate version of the bill cuts more from Medicaid, imposing even stricter work requirements than the House bill. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's a Democrat of Texas. She's running to serve as ranking member of the Oversight Committee, and she joins me now. Good to have you here.
Good to see you.
Let's start with the polling because it strikes me as both sort of encouraging for those opponents of the bill, also a huge messaging opportunity because a third of people don't have an opinion of it. So you've got 23 support, 42% oppose, 34% no opinion. What does that say to you?
Yeah, it says that we still have a lot of work to do as it relates to kind of getting the message out. I do appreciate the fact that we've had some time, which is something that we didn't have when we went through the continuing resolution fight that we had, where you know who sent out a tweet and all of a sudden a bill went kaput. And so I do appreciate that we're kind of getting through it, but you're talking about pages and pages of legislation. And then you have, you know, the Trump administration throwing things out like, oh, we're not going to put a tax on this, so you should love it. But they're not telling the other side of the story. Like at the end of the day, would you rather have a tax bill that may be $5, you know, less that you're normally keeping in your pockets, but you don't have this crazy random healthcare bill?
Right.
Probably so, right? Like, and the reality is that people are going to die. You know, listening to the stories of people that literally have only been able to live because of Medicaid, it's heartbreaking. And the fact that we're talking about rich people just keeping more money in their pockets while literally other people are going to die, it sounds anti-American and definitely sounds anti-patriotic.
So one of the things that generally when I've covered big bills in domestic policy in D.C., you know, there's this idea of like the Senate is like the cooling saucer and that, you know, and that usually things come back from the Senate like more moderate, but both on the left and the right. That is generally the way things go. It seems to me like Ron Johnson and the sort of right-wing faction in the Senate is actually pushing to make this bill more aggressive on the cuts side. And I'm wondering if you were anticipating that or if you thought you were expecting a more moderate bill.
No, I was expecting the Senate to fix everything. I mean, I was expecting it still to come back as a bad bill, but we're talking about
it would get better.
Correct. I thought it would get better. We're talking about a bill that only made it through the House by one vote.
Right.
One vote. So literally it's like two people went AWOL, right? And another two Republicans voted with the Dems. And then another one just said, listen, I'm just going to white light this or, you know, vote present.
Yeah.
And so I expected in the Senate, especially because think about it this way. Our congressional districts are approximately 766,000 people. And so literally there are some Republicans that don't have any hospitals whatsoever in their districts. But then you start talking about the Senate, every single state senator has hospitals. And when you start to talk about rural hospitals possibly shutting down because they don't have enough funding because you're now cutting this Medicaid funding and they can't supplement because they don't have all these other people coming in with, say, private insurance, I thought the senators would say, listen, we can't do this.
Well, you know, it's funny you say that because one of the things, my understanding, again, the details here get a little complicated, but there's this mechanism called the provider tax, which actually would hurt hospitals.
Yeah.
Let's sort of do the short version that way. They're trying to squeeze more revenue. My feeling always when I used to cover Congress day in, day out was that the hospitals were big interest groups.
They are.
They will drop money on your head if they don't like it. They will be up in your office.
Yes.
Where are the hospitals? Honestly, it's wild to me that they have not shown up in a big way.
I don't know.
To fight this bill.
I have no idea. I mean, it's kind of like you saw the farmers, right? Like when we were going through that, like continuing resolution, the farmers were like, wait a minute. Like they showed up, like the Farm Bureau was like, we are here, right? And so it is odd because the hospital lobby is a really big lobby.
The Senate Finance Committee has released the draft text for its portion of President Trump's budget reconciliation bill. It includes a proposal to permanently extend the state and local tax deduction cap at $10,000. That is different to the $40,000 cap that was in the House's version of the bill. And this comes as the Senate looks to push that bill to President Trump's desk by the upcoming July 4th recess, not too long from now. And for more on this, let's bring in congressional correspondent Nicole Killion. Nicole, what else stands out to you with this reconciliation text, and how are lawmakers reacting to some of these changes?
Yeah, well, that SALT change is a big one, even though it impacts only certain portions of the country in terms of states like California and New York, where the state and local taxes, in the view of many lawmakers, is too high. So that's why they wanted to raise the cap on those deductions. So over in the House, that cap had been raised to $40,000 that family or an individual could deduct. Well, now under the Senate version, they have reduced it back to that $10,000 cap, although it extends that cap permanently. It was due to expire at the end of this year, but already we are hearing from a number of House Republicans who were involved in those very delicate negotiations with the House Speaker, criticizing this, particularly the Republican chairs of the SALT caucus, who say that this undermines the work that they did on this issue, that they hope the Senate will still continue to have discussions with them about this. There's a New York Republican, Mike Lawler, who's been very vocal on this issue, threatening to vote no against the final bill if this $10,000 cap remains.
And one of the other major sticking points, Nicole, has been potential cuts to Medicaid. So how did the Senate Finance Committee address that in this bill?
Yeah, well, that is another issue. I mean, clearly, when we're talking about the Senate Finance Committee, they have jurisdiction over the tax portion of this package and the Medicaid portion of this package. So in terms of Medicaid, one of the changes that was made was to this issue of provider taxes, which, you know, if you get into the nitty gritty of this for people who work in the healthcare sector, what this means is that in the Senate version, they have now brought that percentage down to 3.5%. And, you know, why that is significant is that states use these provider taxes as a way to fund their Medicaid programs, particularly in states that have Medicaid expansion. So by lowering that percentage or that provider tax, that basically some critics argue
Trump's budget bill is failing. Again, guys, we really need to understand this. It is failing. The Senate is talking about amendments this, amendments that, making this part less crazy, making this part more crazy. All of that is academic because the bill has failed. If the bill is amended, the bill is rejected because it's got to go back to the House and it's game over, right? And right now you're seeing the same broad themes, and I don't think they're going to solve it because the original concern from a lot of people was that it was simultaneously too right-wing, not right-wing enough, and they made it less insane a little bit in the House. I'm not defending the bill because no Democrat voted for it, and correctly so. In order to win over Republicans in like suburban New York, suburban California, you know, the bluest parts of even some red states where the Democrats can win the House because they know they're afraid of that reality if the cuts are too extreme. And so it's gone to the Senate, and what we're seeing is cuts that are amped up to win over some right-wing senators. But if that happens, it could go back to the House and lose votes there. So any way you slice it, Donald's plan is failing. And all of these other things, and I'm not calling them distractions as in it's, because they are important, but like Trump wants you to look at all these important things and forget about this one thing. But I know you guys aren't forgetting about it.